Hey, this is Craig here. I wasn't able to record the actual online call that we just did for the first session of this LST reflection group, so I thought I'd make a quick recording of the content that we covered here. So, first of all, why are we doing these reflection groups? Well, LST projects are very intensive experiences, and people who go on them often experience God in ways that they haven't before, or Scripture in ways that they haven't before, or community in ways they haven't, or even spiritual struggles in ways that they haven't before. These are often very intensive experiences, usually because of good things, but sometimes they're intensive because things happened on our project that we didn't expect, or perhaps that we didn't even want to happen. And these kinds of intensive experiences often create change or a desire for change at a deep level in us. People often come back from even a 2-week project and they feel different, or they see themselves different, and many who come back from projects do so with a desire for some kind of change in their own life. But at the same time, most of us, as soon as we return home, get busy with the stuff of our normal life. We've had an intensive experience, but it seems to somehow drift into the back of our consciousness as so-called real life takes over. So, because of this, because our experiences are intensive, because they generate the possibility for change in our own lives, the desire for change, if not the change itself, and because if left to the natural flow of events as we return home, we won't pull as much from the experience as God might want us to. Because of all of that, we need time to process these experiences. So a couple metaphors that might be interesting to you. One is the metaphor of a sapling. One writer in the area of missions has suggested that in terms of our short-term experience, we might consider the metaphor of a sapling or a young tree. A sapling is so flexible that if you pull it, it'll bend pretty easily. But if you let it go, it snaps right back into their original shape. And this writer says that that may be the way it is when it comes to our mission experience. We were bent into a new shape for a time, but now that we're home, the tendency is for us to bend back into our original shape. And what we really need is something that would hold us in place for a longer period of time. And that's where you get things like this pretzel tree then, something that's been held in shape, and so it starts to assume that shape. And this reflecting that I'm suggesting that we do, that's the kind of thing that can help us stay perhaps in the shape that God was bending us during our project, and help us take specific action steps that He may be calling us to. So that's one metaphor, is that of the sapling. Another metaphor is from the story in Luke chapter 24 of the disciples on the road to Emmaus. You're probably very familiar with that story. At the end of the story, Luke says, "Then the two from Emmaus told their story of how Jesus had appeared to them as they were walking along the road, and how they had recognized Him as He was breaking the bread." Well, when we return home from our projects, almost all of us realize that Jesus was with us on the road. So maybe being on the road was like being on our project. We realize that Jesus was with us. But like the Emmaus disciples, God continues to mold us after the journey through additional moments of reflection where we recognize Jesus' ongoing presence. And so that's the goal of this reflection group, these times of reflection, is like the Emmaus disciples, to stop the walk, to sit around maybe a metaphorical table and to reflect, and maybe have our eyes open just a little bit more. That's one of the things I like about this painting of that moment, is you can see this guy's in his eyes and the expression on his face that he just has really realized what's happening, that Jesus is with him. So that's the kind of thing that we're looking to do in these groups. All right, then just a very quick summary of the first 3 chapters of Gary Green's book that you can read very quickly. There's not a ton of content there, but let me summarize these 3 chapters briefly. One, this intensive short-term experience raises the question of now what? And so Gary begins with a narrative of his own first time short-term mission experience, a trip to Venezuela that felt life-changing to him, especially at first, and brought up all these questions about the direction of his life and what that means and what God's doing it in. And you may or may not have had that kind of experience in terms of doing Let's Start Talking, where it really shifted how you think about your life and the direction of it. But I think we can identify with what's happening there, that when we go on a project like this, that it creates these changes in our life and these new understandings in our life, new experiences of God in our life. And so then he has second chapter 2 there, where he just talks about, so how are you going to know God's will anyway? If you feel like God's leading you in a certain direction because of a short-term mission experience, then how do you understand God's will? And so he talks about the dot theory, the ditch theory, and the dad theory of understanding God's will. And the dot theory is just that God's got one will for your life, and so you better get it right. He's determined everything for you, exactly where to go, when to go, who to go with. All of it is determined. And so Gary talks about the advantages and disadvantages of thinking about God in that way. And then the ditch theory is basically, look, you can make your own decisions. God doesn't have to have all that planned out for you, but be moral as you do it. Look like Jesus as you do it. Don't sin. Be a good person. You make your own decisions. And then the dad theory of God's will, that just like you would with your kids, you're eager for them to make good decisions, to enjoy what they're doing, consider their giftedness, their special personalities, and so that maybe that's how God is working with us. So his primary there is just to give thought to, well, how are you going to think about God's will in your life as you think about what his will is for you as a result of this experience? And then in chapter 3, which is the primary one for this time of reflection, he reminds us of the importance of the Ebenezer, the stone of help. And so he retells that story from 1 Samuel chapter 7, a time when God stepped into the life of Israel in a significant way. And then as a result, they set up this stone, this memorial, to remind themselves and others that God had acted in a decisive way. I pulled this quote from that chapter. It's a little long, but I think it's a helpful summary. Often in life we have major experiences that seem transformative and unforgettable in the moment, yet life continues and we become busy with other things. Those events can become long memory. Our minds can only process so much information, and research indicates that our minds typically work with only the most recently acquired information. In other words, we are wired so that what is urgent often takes priority over what is important. This means that major events, even God encounters, frequently have much less effect on our lives than we care to admit. One way to avoid the loss of the effect of significant events is to name them and reflect on them. By clearly identifying and defining an event, we give it the opportunity to move to a deeper level of consciousness in our hearts and our heads. And so that set the stage for what we talked about in our call today, is just this question of how did you see God during your recent LST project? There might be a lot of ways, or only a few ways, or only one way, but how did you see God during your recent LST project? And so we reflected on that, and that's one question that I want to encourage us to be thinking about over this time of reflection, is how did we see God at work? So we talked about that for a while today. And then setting the stage for our next meeting, which is over chapters 4 and 5. Again, very short chapters. You can read them very quickly. But it raises these two questions. What spiritual giant did you meet on your journey, and what did you learn about yourself on this journey? A spiritual giant, and what did you learn about yourself on this journey? So those are the two questions we want to be thinking about until we meet again. So those two questions to be reflecting on. Okay? So, I think you can see that the real and the best work of these groups is going to happen when we're not together, when we're not trying to meet online. That is the time that you take in reflecting and praying about and talking with others about these kinds of questions. So I really urge you over the next week to reflect regularly on these two questions. And then when we get together, we can talk about it a little bit. But the real work is what happens in the week between our sessions together. And let me preview ahead just a little bit by saying that one thing I'd like you to be also thinking about is whether God is calling you to some kind of action step, either action of doing or action of being, as a result of your experience and as a result of this time of reflection over the whole 3 sessions here. Is there something God's calling you to as a result of that? Okay? So that then put us on just a reminder about our next meeting, which would be 1 week away from now. We'll get back on, and I'll be sending a couple messages out to remind you about all of that and to remind you about the platform. We had some difficulty with our platform, so we had to change that quickly, but I'll remind you about all that. So my prayers are with you, and I hope you'll really take advantage during this week of some time of reflection. Thanks a lot, and I'll be in touch.